Hello, I'm John Buenker. In the previous segment, we have seen how Racine's various ethnic groups worked in the private sector to create a network of voluntary organizations that formed a protective environment and provided for a wide variety of physical, emotional, spiritual, and intellectual needs. But as important as these institutions were, they were not the entire story. No one lived totally among his own people, and few relied solely on the private sector to meet all their needs. Much of Racine's immigrant experience lies in the interaction between the various ethnic groups and the larger society. Ethnic groups engaged in politics to forward their interests, and in the process both changed and were changed. Other contacts with the city's society and culture also initiated a two-way process of change, especially on the course of generations. Trying to identify what has persisted and what has changed or been lost is the most difficult task in understanding Racine's ethnic experience. Political activity was an effective means for newly arrived minorities to gain benefits denied them through other channels. Once an immigrant group had a significant number of eligible voters, it could wring concessions from those who dominated the city's social and economic life. The local alderman or party precinct captain most often met the needs of immigrant communities for having streets, sidewalks, and schools repaired, recreational facilities, or garbage collection. They also had the leverage to secure jobs on the city payroll or with contractors and businessmen who dealt with the city. Politicians frequently functioned as community relations counselors, settling arguments between tenants and landlords, customers and shopkeepers, husbands and wives, parents and children. They had the connections to secure licenses and permits or to intercede with the police when a husband or son ran afoul of the law. In short, the local politician acted as the middleman between his constituents and the strange system outside the neighborhood. Aldermen or precinct captains were originally members of an earlier ethnic group. They had to learn to understand and respect the language and customs of newcomers to their district if they hoped to maintain their position. By the same token, each ethnic group tried to place one of its own people in these key positions as soon as their numbers and skills allowed, on the grounds that they better understood the needs and attitudes of the community. Astute politicians quickly learned the game of recognition politics, of granting political posts to newly arrived groups in order to ensure their loyalty. The appointment or election of a fellow ethnic not only assured a sympathetic voice in city hall or party circles, but also forced other groups to regard as compatriots with increased respect. It enhanced the group's self-esteem to see one from their own ranks in a position of power and influence. Lastly, political action was often vital to protect cherished customs and traditions from attacks by Americanizers. Nothing so united an immigrant community and spurred it to political action as did proposals to close parochial schools, prohibit the use of foreign language, regulate drinking habits, or dictate observance of the Sabbath. Personal liberty was a slogan which aroused deep-seated emotions in all ethnic minorities. The two most explosive ethno-cultural issues revolved around the use of alcoholic beverages and foreign language in the parochial schools. The Native American churches and those immigrants whose religion was derived from Calvinism generally opposed the use of alcohol and felt justified in suppressing its use. Catholics, most Lutherans and Episcopalians, Orthodox Christians, Jews, and Bohemian free-thinkers, on the other hand, regarded alcoholic beverages as beneficial if used wisely and relied upon personal temperance under the guidance of the Church. Some Scandinavian Lutherans, more influenced by Calvinism, leaned toward legal prohibition, but German Lutherans were unalterably opposed. The Calvinist religions also practiced the Puritan Sabbath, forbidding all forms of worldly pleasure, while most European immigrants believed in a continental Sunday, a judicious mixture of worship and recreation. The reformers' main target was the saloon, the working man's social club, and the base of operations for ethnic politicians. In the late 19th century, prohibition and the Sunday closing of saloons was strongly pushed by a combination of Protestant ministers and industrialists of British, American, Calvinist ancestry who hoped to replace the saloon with coffee and reading salons. In the 1860s, the German and Bohemian press led a successful effort to defeat Mayor George C. Northrop because of his strict enforcement of the liquor laws. Prohibition Party candidates regularly received almost no support on the North Side. In 1882, a petition to force Sunday closing of saloons was presented by the City Council by Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, and Congregationalist ministers, mostly of Yankee, British, or Scandinavian derivation. It was also backed by 450 of the city's industrialists, mostly from similar backgrounds.
The German, Irish, and Bohemian aldermen, however, succeeded in squelching most such attempts. One German saloon keeper, arrested for being open on Sunday at the complaint of a Yankee socialite, screamed at her husband, "Your woman, your woman, why don't you hold her mit a string." Hi, Mike, how you doing? Have a mug of beer, please? Thank you. Probably the most famous and ardent foe of prohibition in any form was Martin Secor, the bombastic Bohemian freethinker, industrialist, and politician. Early in the century, Secor issued two strongly worded broadsides entitled "Warning to the Taxpayer" and "Greer Not Here, but His Ghost Is." In the first, he warned that closing saloons would cost the city $115,000 in lost license fees, while in the second, he attacked Racine's chief advocate of prohibition, Reverend Albert Greer of Good Shepherd Methodist Church. An avowed foe of religions that tried to impose their moral views on others, Secor contrasted their outlook with that of many immigrant churches. If these gentlemen only knew enough to keep still as the German Catholics and German Lutherans and take care of their own affairs and stay in their own churches and not stick their nose into public affairs, they would be more appreciated. Most Southern and Eastern Europeans also opposed prohibition at the time of its enactment. They and the Germans and Bohemians and Irish suffered through the outwardly dry 1920s, finding solace in homemade wine and beer, stills, speakeasies, and soft drink parlors. In 1933, these ethnic groups voted overwhelmingly in favor of repealing the odious affront to their personal liberty. Although Racine County voted an overwhelming 5-1 in favor of repeal, there were some significant ethnic trends. The Irish and German 4th Ward and the German and Bohemian 15th voted nearly 20-1 in favor of repeal, while the heavily Polish, Slovak, Hungarian, and Italian 14th supported it nearly 10-1. The only wards below the citywide average were areas with substantial Yankee, British, or Scandinavian populations. In the towns, repeal fared best in Burlington, Waterford, and Caledonia, with their predominantly German, Bohemian, and Irish populations. It failed to carry English settlement in Rochester and barely passed in Union Grove and Yorkville, sites of other British populations. In largely Scandinavian Norway and Raymond, the repeal vote was significantly below the county average.
The issue of foreign language instruction in public and parochial schools was also a divisive ethno-cultural issue. Passage of the Bennett Law requiring English language instruction in the Wisconsin legislature in 1890 mobilized the state's Bohemians, Germans, and Polish voters to drive the offending Republicans out of office. The topic of bilingual education in Spanish continues to stir up controversy in the 1970s. Ethnic politics was also evident in the struggle for recognition among the various nationalities. Appointment or election of an ethnic candidate gave his countrymen a sense of esteem, increased their opportunities for material benefits, and enhanced their defenses against discrimination. The ethnic composition of the city council and the school board, elected by wards, was usually a fairly accurate reflection of the population distribution, while the competition for city and county-wide office among ethnic candidates was usually intense. Although voters often supported one of their own, regardless of party, ethnic groups usually affiliated with one or the other of the two major parties, with a high degree of consistency. Throughout the 19th century, Yankees, Scandinavians, British, and German Protestants formed the solid core of Republican votes, while Irish, Bohemians, and German Catholics leaned heavily toward the Democratic side. The latter party was associated with easy naturalization and personal liberty on the issues of prohibition and Sunday blue laws. Ultimately, the bulk of Southern and Eastern European new immigrants threw in their lot with the Democrats as well, because they identified with its cultural liberalism and sympathy toward labor and welfare legislation.
The city's most recent arrivals have generally followed the Democratic trend, although like the new immigrants, it has taken them many years to make their influence felt in party circles. 19th century blacks were nearly all Republicans, a legacy of the party's early civil rights record. One black resident summed up the attitude eloquently. "I've always voted the Republican ticket. In them days, you know, that was the colored man's hobby, because they wanted to give Abraham Lincoln credit for what he'd done for black people. And any time that you saw or heard of a person, a Negro, voting the Democratic ticket, he was thrown out of society." Frequently, the offender was referred to as a Democratic nigger. Even so, the only 19th century black officeholder, Coroner Peter Thomas, was a Democrat. It was the Great Depression, the New Deal, and the civil rights record of the Democrats after World War II, though, that caused the great majority of blacks to switch allegiance. They are responding, in the view of one black activist, to the relative liberality of the Democratic Party.
and inner-city precincts consistently returned strong majorities for that party in the 1960s and 70s. For nearly 140 years, the almost constant influx of ethnic, racial, and religious minorities have interacted with Racine's existing society and culture. Although the exact nature of that process is still debated, discussion revolves around three alternatives. Has Racine been a kind of melting pot in which various nationalities and races have come together to form an American stew? Or has each new ethnic minority had to Americanize, to conform to the social patterns and cultural values established by the original Yankee settlers? Or has Racine been much more like a salad bowl, where ethnically based social and cultural differences have persisted down to the present day? Despite the passage of time and generations, do national origins still affect with whom people work, play, live, worship, and marry? To what extent, if any, does old world culture still influence a person's attitude toward food, drink, marriage, sex, child rearing, success, joy, sorrow, death, and the whole range of human experience? Satisfactory answers to these questions await years of concentrated investigation, but there are many indications that it would be premature to proclaim the demise of ethnic differences in Racine. The pressures on European immigrants and their descendants to Americanize or melt have been extremely strong. The ending of mass immigration cut off the flow of fresh recruits and severed the most direct tie with the old country. Only a handful of second and third generation individuals achieved any facility with the mother tongue, the transmitter of culture. Ethnic neighborhoods have gradually broken up as younger generations have moved anywhere that their desires and finances allow. Many of the children and grandchildren of immigrants have also moved into management, business, and professional careers, integrating Racine's economic life at many levels. Contacts with other nationalities in work, politics, school, unions, and recreation have also broken down many ethnic barriers. Intermarriage across ethnic lines has become increasingly more commonplace, making many third-generation individuals human melting pots. The Poles have married the Italians, the Irish have married the Slovaks, a Slovak priest is noted, and even the Danes are not separated anymore. Ethnic businesses now serve a much larger clientele than their own nationality, and everyone's diet contains a smorgasbord of ethnic dishes. Many of the fraternal and benevolent societies have disappeared or lost much of their ethnic distinctiveness by the admission of the children of interethnic marriages. Most societies have suffered a steady decline in membership, and some have increasingly become akin to American social lodges, with dimming memories of their ethnic origins. Government programs have replaced most of the society's benefit programs, while others have evolved into insurance companies with nationwide connections. National societies and churches have abandoned most of their cultural and recreational programs, especially for the young, because they are unable to compete with the mass media. Most of the members have entered the channel of Racine life, and they belong to other groups. A past president of the German Men's Club lamented in 1974, "I don't think the young people today belong to clubs. They're more on the loose." Churches that once included a national designation in their titles generally have membership lists sprinkled with a cross-section of ethnic names. Originally, this parish was a German parish, a Catholic pastor has observed. Now it serves about 20 nationalities, but I preach to them in English. We once had a Lithuanian, Bohemian, and a Slovak service, but these national groups are pretty well blurred. 2 of our parishes are considered Italian parishes, but the priests that serve them don't speak Italian themselves. A fellow Catholic priest concurred, adding that at odd hours here at the church, I'll hold a service in Slovak, just for the old-timers. Americanization, at least in a cultural sense, was also demanded of Racine's immigrants by their predecessors. The public schools stressed the superiority of American values and institutions in every conceivable way. Night education programs for adults, whether in industry or school, concentrated upon the English language and citizenship training. The YMCA, native Protestant churches, and social workers stressed the adoption of American culture as the key to success and happiness. As early as 1883, the YMCA taught English to German and Scandinavian immigrants, referred them to boarding houses and jobs, and sponsored religious meetings, musicals, lectures, and readings. The all-important question, the organization noted, is not how to work for the Scandinavians, but how to rouse the Scandinavians to work for others. The Daughters of the American Revolution also assisted aliens in studying English and learning the American ways. The pressures to Americanize were greatly intensified during World War I, especially for German Americans. The latter were forced to register as enemy aliens, and groups such as the Protective League circulated scurrilous stories that affected prominent citizens of German extraction. Those who left town were said to have defected or been imprisoned for treason. Most German churches and organizations prudently accelerated their conversion to English and stressed their Americanness. Racine was one of many American cities to hold a mass meeting endorsing a national Americanization program in 1918, and the Ku Klux Klan directed its fire at Catholics and Jews during the 1920s until the Knights of Columbus and the B'nai B'rith mounted an effective counterattack. Southern and Eastern Europeans suffered too from a certain attitude of hauteur and condescension assumed by the supposedly superior Nordic races, who had been fortunate enough to have undergone their misfortunes a generation earlier, and who were now in possession of the American land and wealth their fathers had sacrificed and toiled to acquire. Although all immigrants felt the pressures to Americanize to some degree, there were important differences. Rural and small-town residents were usually less subject to pressures for cultural conformity than city people. They were often better able to maintain a separate identity and culture. Immigrants who were British, Northwestern European, or Protestant usually aroused less antagonism and had less trouble adjusting than those who professed other religions and came from other lands. The latter often embraced American political and economic traditions readily enough, but clung to their traditional religious and cultural values and practices, especially when challenged by nativist organizations. Nor did the adoption of American ways necessarily guarantee social acceptance. Many native-born Americans wanted them to be more like us, but to keep a safe distance when it came to housing, schooling, recreation, and above all, marriage. Finally, groups adhering to a national religion, such as the Armenians, Greeks, Serbs, and Jews, have usually maintained a separate identity and culture much longer than those who belong to ethnically divided religions. With all the forces making for Americanization, it is not surprising that various commentators predicted an early end to ethnic differences in Racine. In 1901, the Racine Daily Journal concluded that the welding of these nationalities has presented no difficulty here, for contentment, peaceful relations, and intermarriages of almost daily occurrence have eradicated all racial animosities, if indeed any ever did exist in Racine. Even the influx of Southern and Eastern Europeans did not alter the situation in the view of the Journal Times almost half a century later, when it pronounced that the tradition of clannishness has been fading in the new generation. Slowly the melting pot theory has been taking hold. Danish girls marry Bohemian boys, Irish boys marry German girls. Foreign languages give way to English, European customs to American ideals. Before the city has seen its second centennial, most of the old traditions of European origins will have faded into the tradition of an American city. The public school system celebrated the same theme in a 1948 pantomime by concluding that rightfully and truly America can be called the melting pot of the world, and that our own community, in providing a place of settlement, has helped with the process of assimilation. In so doing, the people in time have become Americanized and are of one mind and spirit in the new national growth. Even the city's Jews, according to a 1942 scholar, had become a vital part of community life, belonging to civic groups and country clubs. Outside observers, too, found that colorful national groups, like the Danes, who are still numerous, now remain different, more as a matter of nostalgic recognition on special public occasions of the melting pot heritage of the community. Despite this widely held view, there is ample evidence to suggest that the course of ethnic harmony has not always been so smooth, and that the degree of Americanization has not been quite so complete. Every immigrant group experienced some form of prejudice and discrimination, both from earlier arrivals and from other newcomers competing for jobs, housing, and other benefits. Every group that came over, an Italian-American recently observed, went through that period. Old world feuds that had persisted for centuries did not disappear with emigration. Irishmen who wandered into Scandinavian Sagetown or neighboring German and Bohemian sections had to be prepared to fight, and it was greatly resented when boys from other parts of town came to the Irish section to date the girls. Danes and Germans fought each other on the river, and Bohemians and Germans often clashed on the north side. British Protestants and Irish Catholics continued the antagonism they had developed for each other in their homelands. Native-born Americans often looked down upon all the old immigrant groups, giving only grudging acceptance to them as the younger generations became more Americanized. The influx of new immigrants also hastened acceptance of most Northwestern Europeans, whose customs and beliefs seemed less alarming by comparison. Descendants of the old immigrants joined Yankees in ridiculing Dagos, Hunkies, Polacks, Kikes, Bohunks, or Ruskies. Jews especially were the victims of prejudice from nearly every quarter until recently. Italians and other Southern Europeans were segregated in theaters and bars, and one Armenian woman remembers trying to bleach her skin to appear more American. During the labor strife of 1919, a middle-aged Lithuanian worker was assaulted by a policeman for his lack of literacy and told that you ought to be shot if you can't read. A young Polish mother who urged female workers not to scab during a strike in the same year was called a dirty Polak and hauled off to jail. Employers sought to stir up nativist feelings against foreign-born strikers by running newspaper ads asking if you object to being dominated by a bunch of aliens, especially in your own country.
Assimilation, even among white Racinites of European extraction, has not proceeded beyond some fairly clearly defined boundaries. Social interaction and intermarriage has proceeded much more slowly than political recognition or economic mobility. Even marriages across ethnic lines still largely take place within the boundaries of the major religious denominations, creating a kind of religious melting pot. Further movement in that direction usually requires the abandonment of the deepest felt sense of ethnic and religious identity, a price few are willing to pay. Ethnic identity has often persisted into the third and fourth generation and may even be on the upswing, as witnessed by such projects as Old World, Wisconsin. Grandchildren of immigrants, more secure in their American identities and unhappy with life in an immobile, materialistic, and impersonal society, sometimes feel freer to reach back for the cultural heritage of their ancestors. What the son tries to forget, as immigrant historian Marcus Lee Hansen has written, the grandson seeks to remember. One knowledgeable Armenian has recently observed that the third generation is more ethnically conscious than the second, and that now the thing is to be ethnic. After reaching a low point in the 1950s, several ethnic organizations have undergone a modest revival of membership in the past 2 decades, spurred partly by the revival of ethnic consciousness. St. Stanislaus School reintroduced the study of the Polish language and culture in 1973 because, according to its principle, we felt like all nationalities that if we didn't do something about it, the language and culture will become obsolete. Lithuanians are also trying to revive their heritage by teaching the language and staging Old World dances and plays. All Eastern Europeans lobby for the liberation of their homelands from Russian control, welcome refugees, and send economic help to friends and relatives abroad. Captive Nations Week is still seriously observed by these nationalities, and its activities heighten their sense of ethnicity and culture. If our children would forget their Lithuanian language and forget that they are Lithuanian, a prominent Racine displaced person has declared, I don't think Lithuania will ever be free. Jews, too, continue to aid their Russian co-religionists and to maintain ties to Israel. The Roma Lodge continues to flourish, and a prominent restaurant family recently readopted its Italian name. Armenians continue to teach their language, observe the old religious rituals, and aid friends and relatives through the Revolutionary Foundation for Independent Armenia. The 60th anniversary of the Armenian massacre was observed by several hundred people in both religious and public ceremonies. The building of a new Orthodox church has symbolized the continuing togetherness of the Greek community. Old immigrants, too, despite their long residence in Racine, have not entirely abandoned their ethnic identity and culture. Danish churches still hold foreign language services on special occasions and hold Abelskov sales in the spring. Freedom and Constitution Day is still observed on June 5th, and the visit of the Danish monarch in April of 1976 drew tens of thousands of well-wishers. The Danish city of Aalborg has become Racine's sister city, and visits between the two are common. Bohemian Americans continue their Sokol activity and recently reopened their Caledonia School as a living schoolhouse museum. The German Men's Club continues to operate, although the Women's Club recently disbanded, and many German Americans belong to the Kenosha Racine chapter of the German American National Congress. Irish Americans recently sought to restore interest in their origins by founding the Shamrock Club, which consists of several Irish couples who panic in December and begin planning for a party on March 17th. The ethnic food fairs at Memorial Hall have sparked renewed interest among thousands in Old World food, customs, and music. While it is too early to tell whether these and similar manifestations of ethnic diversity will persist, increase, or slowly fade away, it is at least certain that as the mid-1970s, Racine's various European immigrant groups have not yet melted into some great homogeneous pool of Anglos or whites. Our ethnic heritage, in spite of the melting pot, one Armenian recently observed, has not yet disappeared. The assimilation and acculturation of Racine's blacks and Chicanos is an even more complex process. Their differences from the dominant society are racial as well as cultural, a condition that is likely to define their uniqueness for the foreseeable future. Racial minorities are clearly more different than our cultural ones. A person may be American on the job and ethnic in his personal life, but he is black or brown all the time. Moreover, racial minorities arrived at a time when many of the traditional stepping stones to better social status, such as education, small business, and unskilled jobs, had largely become victims of economic centralization, technology, and population trends. Finally, assimilation and acculturation are no longer as popular as they once were. Integration has largely taken a back seat to black power, brown power, and renewed consciousness among white ethnics. For all that, though, blacks and Mexican Americans face the same basic dilemma as did European immigrants before them: how to be white enough or Anglo enough to survive and prosper in the wider society, and yet retain enough of their distinctive heritage to foster personal identity and dignity. The small black community that existed before World War II aroused little overt antagonism. Its members kept largely to themselves and remained largely in the service occupations. Racine had a residue of anti-slavery left over from the Glover case and the Underground Railroad. In 1853, the city's most prominent citizens pronounced the federal fugitive slave law palpably unconstitutional, inhuman, unchristian, and diabolical, and warned a slave catcher to make himself scarce, otherwise we shall have fears for the future safety of his person. Such prominent blacks as John Bailey, Logan Davis, and Peter Thomas were highly respected and esteemed. Even as late as 1943, Governor Walter Goodland, a Racine native, earned general applause for his refusal to extradite escaped Negro prisoners to Alabama because he feared that they would be denied equal protection of the laws. Even the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s was more hostile toward Catholics and Jews than toward the small concentration of blacks. Even so, according to one prominent black leader, Racine has a unique way of hiding their discrimination, and they have always done so. The great influx of blacks during World War II increased racial tensions. The newcomers competed for factory jobs and housing with foreign stock whites. The large federal trailer housing projects in Northside and Lakeside became instant ghettos that magnified white fears. The latter saw blacks as responsible for crime and delinquency, the rising cost of welfare, the decline of education, the decay of housing, and the declining economy. Blacks felt that they were victims rather than causes, and attributed their difficulties to prejudice and discrimination, manifested in de facto segregation in housing, jobs, recreation, schools, and public accommodations, in police brutality, and in the rise of the White Citizens Council and other groups. Being black in America, NAACP official Julian Thomas claimed, was like playing football against 12 men. Mexican Americans faced similar problems and found no Mexicans allowed signs on many businesses and boarding houses. Several prominent industrialists who employed the bulk of the city's minority workers took the lead in the late 1960s in forming the Racine Environment Committee, which sought summer jobs, scholarships, job training, housing, and small business loans for minorities. Minority leaders and organizations, such as the NAACP, the Urban League, LULAC, and the Concerned Minority Group Citizens, also pressed hard in these areas and forced the creation of the Community Action Program. Their primary goals were an end to discrimination in all aspects of Racine life: open housing, school desegregation, job opportunity, and an end to white-only clauses in fraternal organizations. With sociologist Lyle Shannon,
blacks and Chicanos have held that economic absorption may be a prerequisite to cultural integration, that you cannot become like members of the host society until you have the ability to purchase the things they purchase. It takes a job, and a steady job, to become a member of the larger society. At the same time, blacks have sought to persuade schools to stress Afro-American history and culture, to raise the consciousness both of their own children and of the wider community. Like white ethnics, they maintain close contact with friends and relatives in the southern states through correspondence, frequent return visits, and by sending food, clothing, and money back home. Mexican Americans concentrated upon the creation of bilingual or multicultural programs in the public schools. Even though they learned enough English to function in the wider society, many Chicanos emulated European immigrants in seeking to maintain their mother tongue for other purposes. A 1970 survey found that only 20% of the adult sample spoke no Spanish at all, and that almost half the children spoke at least some Spanish. A recent minority history project also found that the younger generation is becoming more militant about their culture and heritage. They are fully aware of their double heritage. The 1975 celebration of Mexican Independence Day drew large crowds of Chicanos seeking to maintain their old world ties.
The American equation, Catherine Newman has written, is based upon the belief that all Americans are created equal but unlike. Nowhere has the tension between equality and uniqueness been more evident than in Racine. Its people are the product of nearly 150 years of migration from almost every part of the world. Racine's mixture of ethnic elements has been so apparent that Richard Engler chose it as one of 8 communities in the entire United States in which to study the challenge of diversity.
Yet whenever and from wherever they came, Racine's immigrants fled similar situations and aspired to similar goals. Faced with life in an increasingly urban industrial environment, they responded in strikingly similar ways, forming ethnic enclaves, creating cultural and self-help organizations, engaging in ethnic politics, and seeking to maintain distinctive identity and culture, and pursuing social and residential mobility. No one can yet predict what Racine's eventual solution to the American equation will be, but it is clear that its final shape is far from complete. The process begun by Dutch Pete has yet to run its course.